Some stories begin with a wedding, and this one does too, but not in the way you might think. There is a tale from the old kingdoms of Germany of a princess sent across the world to marry a prince she had never met, with only her own horse for a friend, and a small white kerchief stained with 3 drops of her mother's blood. She lost the kerchief at a river crossing. She lost the horse soon after. She did not lose her name, but for a long while no one was allowed to hear it. This is the story of the Goose Girl and of the wind that knew the truth, and of the iron stove that finally heard it spoken aloud. The old queen sat at her chamber window in the high tower of her castle, and she sewed all morning. She was sewing a small square of white linen, the size of a child's handkerchief. When her daughter came into the room dressed for the long journey, the old queen drew a small silver pin from her hair, and she pricked the tip of her own finger, and she let 3 slow drops of red blood fall onto the white cloth. "There," she said. "Keep this with you, on the journey. It is a small magic, and it is all I have to give you. While you have it, no harm can come to you." The princess folded the kerchief twice, and she put it in the front of her gown against her own heart. The old queen kissed her at the gate. She gave her a fine white horse called Falada that could speak with a human voice. She gave her 1 waiting maid for the road, and then she watched her ride out under the portcullis, and she did not weep, because queens are not permitted to weep where the courtiers can see them. They had been riding for half a day when the princess grew thirsty. There was a small stream beside the road, clear and cold, running over pale stones. The princess said, "Please, will you go and fill my cup from the stream?" The waiting maid did not move. The waiting maid said, "If you are thirsty, get down and drink yourself. I am not your servant anymore, not on this road with no one watching." The princess was not used to being spoken to like this. She climbed down. She bent over the water and she drank from her own cupped hand. As she bent forward, the small white kerchief slipped from the front of her gown, and the stream carried it away, 3 red drops in all, and she did not see it go. When she stood up again, the maid was already on the talking horse. The maid was already wearing her own riding cloak, and the maid said, "You will swap with me now. You will wear my clothes. You will give me your name. And you will swear by the open sky above us never to speak 1 word of this to another human soul, as long as you live, or I will kill you here on this road." They came at last to the city of the young prince. The false bride rode in front on the talking horse in the princess's own clothes. The true princess walked behind in the maid's gray dress, her head down. The old king of the country came out to meet them at the palace steps. He took the false bride for his son's wife, and he led her into the great hall. He sent the true princess down to the courtyard to wait. The false bride was clever, and she was already afraid. She knew the horse Falada could speak, and she knew that what he had seen, he could tell. That night she went to the old king, and she made 1 small request as a wedding favor. She asked that the horse Falada be taken away and quietly killed, for it had given her trouble on the road. The old king did not understand the favor, but he granted it. The next morning the stable stood empty, and above the dark gate that the princess had to pass through every morning on her way out to her new work, a horse's head had been nailed up in the shadow of the arch. The Goose Meadow lay outside the city walls, on a low green hill above a stream. The new bride had asked the old king to give the strange girl from the road some humble work, where she could be kept out of sight. And the old king, who was a kind man but not a clever one, sent her to help a young goose boy called Conrad mind the king's geese. Every morning, the princess drove the geese out under the dark gate, and every morning she stopped, and she looked up at the head of her own horse, Falada, nailed in the shadow of the arch, and very softly she said, "Falada, Falada hanging there." And from the dead head a voice came back, soft as a held breath. If your dear mother knew, her heart would break in 2. Then she would drive the geese down the path and out to the meadow. In the meadow, she would sit on the grass and unbind her long hair. Her hair was the color of pale, soft gold. It came down past her waist when it was loose. Conrad the goose boy watched, and he wanted to pull one of the long, bright hairs. So the princess, very quietly, said 3 words under her breath to the wind. And the wind picked up suddenly, and it lifted Conrad's hat from his head, and it carried the hat away across the meadow. And Conrad had to run after it, all the way down the hill and back, by which time her hair was rebraided and her kerchief was tied, and she was sitting quietly with the geese. Conrad went home grumbling. The next morning, the same. The princess at the gate, the horse's head, the voice from the dead lips, the princess on the hill, the unbound gold hair, the muttered words, the rude playful wind, the lost hat. On the 3rd evening, Conrad could bear it no longer. He went to the old king, and he said, "Sir, I will not mind the geese with that strange girl any more. She speaks to a horse's head at the gate. She lets down hair like gold thread. She calls up the wind to play tricks on me." The old king did not laugh. The old king listened. The next morning, very quietly, he hid himself in the shadow of the gate, and he watched, and he heard the soft greeting, and he heard the dead horse answer, and he saw the gold hair come down on the hill, and he saw the wind do what the wind was asked to do. He went home very thoughtful. In the kitchen of the palace stood a great iron stove for baking bread. It was as tall as a man, and it had a deep, dark mouth, and inside it the bricks were warm with all the loaves of the morning. That evening, the old king called the strange girl to him, and he said, "Child, tell me what is wrong." The princess shook her head. "I have sworn by the open sky," she said, "never to tell any human being." Then the old king thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Child, go down to the kitchen tonight, when the cook has gone to her bed, and go to the great iron stove for baking bread, and crawl inside it, and tell your sorrow into the iron. An iron stove is not a human being." The princess went down. She crawled into the warm, dark mouth of the iron stove. She put her face against the bricks, and very quietly she told the whole story, from the silver pin in her mother's tower, to the maid at the stream, to the horse called Falada nailed above the gate. And the old king stood outside the chimney with his head bent close, and he heard every word. The next evening, the old king gave a great feast in the hall. The young prince sat at the high table beside his bride. The strange girl from the meadow was brought up from the kitchen, washed and dressed in a gown of soft cream linen with deep gold embroidery at the collar and the hem, and she was seated quietly at the foot of the table, with her hair bound up under a fine cream kerchief. The young prince looked at her once, and then he looked at her again, and then he forgot the woman beside him entirely. The old king, near the end of the feast, leaned across to the false bride, and he said, "My dear, tell me, what does a woman deserve who would betray her mistress on a journey, take her clothes, steal her name, and lie to a kind family who took her in?" The false bride did not see the trap. She named a long, bitter punishment fitting for so wicked a creature. The old king nodded. Then he stood up. Then he said, "You have named your own sentence." She was sent that night away from the kingdom with 1 horse and 1 cloak, and no one came after her. The true princess took her place at the prince's side. They were married before the next snow, and in the years that came after, on quiet mornings, the princess would walk out of the city under the dark gate and look up at the place where a horse's head once hung. And the head was no longer there, but the wind on the hill above the meadow still remembered her. Some promises, the people of those kingdoms say, are kept by stranger things than people. By a stone, by a wind, by an iron stove that listened. This was Forgotten Fables. Follow the channel when you want the next story the loud world forgot.